Turn your Bibles to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. It's a very familiar passage, I know. But at the same time, too, I thought it would be good for this evening for us to talk about God's formula for joy. There were many years ago, I sat in a chemistry class. I didn't learn much. Wasn't teacher's fault. My brain just didn't work that way. I had actually figured out before this, but I'd figured out that I didn't need to go in the science field. One of the things that I do remember from Miss Combs' chemistry class is formulas. Formulas make up things. This is the atom chart, and this is there's oxygen and carbon and all of these wonderful things that our Earth is made up of. And I do remember that you could mix things such as sodium and chloride, and you ended up with salt. And you could mix a simple mixture of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, and you had what was called a simple sugar. And you could mix oxygen, H2O, hydrogen, and oxygen, and you'd come up with water. And I learned a few of those things in that class. Those were formulas, that mixtures, if you will, that once these atoms are mixed together and mixed, of course, they have to be mixed in a proper order. And I learned all about electron shells and all these things that they make up, these elements make up these, if you will, bigger things. We understand it from the standpoint of we can look at this building and know that as we look at it, there are many, many different little pieces that make up this building. And so it is with joy. Book of Philippians, Paul talks about joy, and he talks about rejoicing in this book, and it's a small book. And as you know, this was a book that was written about the time of the end of the book of Acts. It's 62 AD. Paul's in Roman imprisonment, and Paul sits down, and this is one of those books that he writes. Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians are the three that we think that he wrote about the same time frame. And he wrote this to the church of Philippi. And evidently the church of Philippi were several things. He's talking to them. It's also a letter of thanksgiving as he talks to them. It's a letter also to remind them of the unity that they need because they don't have it, and to have the mind of Christ. We will look at a little bit of some of those things. But then in Philippians chapter 4, this is a passage that has become, if you will, sort of the most reassuring and one of those passages that you like to hold on to because it says so much. And we're going to look at it tonight from the vantage or the standpoint of God's formula. Once again, those little elements that make up something bigger. God's formula for joy. Joy being that feeling of inner peace and tranquility and happiness. You see, sometimes we think, well, first of all, a Christian must be joyful. Well, joy is actually a byproduct or the end result of really having these things in your life. But second of all, a Christian may not necessarily be joyous from the standpoint on top of the world. But if he has God in his life and he has the Lord in his life, there's a peace that comes from that. And not always. I know that. You say, wait a minute, can a Christian be depressed? Can a Christian feel uneasy? Can a Christian have feelings of great anxiety? And the answer is yes. And you say, well, what do you do for that? Well, you get out there and you read a tract that I wrote back on depression, and maybe that'll help you. But first thing you do is you go to your physical doctor. Second thing you do is you go find a friend and you go find somebody that you can talk to. And those are some of the first three steps that you need to take. There are others, of course, prayer and things of that nature, reading scriptures. But those things are all important in dealing with those issues. But in Philippians chapter 4, Paul says, okay, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Verse 4, right? What does he say about verse 5? He says, let your gentleness be known to all men. Okay, rejoice in the Lord. First thing you got to do is let your gentleness be known to all men. Some versions have the word moderation. The word gentleness is a very difficult word to capture. And really, the word itself, when used sparingly in pages of the New Testament, is the idea of an individual that is at peace and at ease. An individual, if you will, that is cooperative with other individuals. An individual that doesn't have to have their way all the time. An individual that looks at it from the standpoint of what is good for the group. May not necessarily be good for me, but what is good and best for the group. Thus, we might kind of paraphrase it this way. It's somebody that's easy to get along with and someone that is easy going and gets along with everyone. Gentle. Paul talked about how that he approached the church of Thessalonica. He says that we were gentle among you. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? In God's formula for happiness, one of the things we have to learn to do is we have to get along with people. We may not always agree with them, may not always see eye to eye with them. We may not be on even the same level as they, but at the same time too, learn to get along with people. When we think about that aspect, we think about that when Jesus was asked what was the great commandment, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and the second is likened to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus deals with the brotherhood of man. The early church, especially in Paul's writings, wanted Christians to understand the importance of dealing with one another. And there are some 22 different ideas, especially in Paul's writings, that deal with the aspect of one another. Go back and look in a concordance. He'll talk about serve one another, and he'll talk about use hospitality one towards another, and love one another, and forgive one another, and all of these aspects of one another. Now, why is that important? Well, look in verse 2 of Philippians chapter 4. I implore Euodia and Syntyche to be of what? The same mind. What's happening? I'll go down to verse 3. Paul, if you will, again implores those that are around them to help these two ladies. Evidently, there's a little problem. These two individuals. They're not seeing eye to eye. They're not getting along. And Paul says, I want you, church, brethren at Philippi, I want you to see what you can do to help these two individuals get along. Now, here's the one thing I've always thought about when I think about that. And you remember, Paul sat down and he wrote these epistles, and Paul wrote this letter to the church of Philippi. And then what happened? Well, they would receive the letter, and guess what? They'd stand up and read it. They'd read it in public assembly. They'd read it in the worship service. Now imagine if you're Euodia and Syntyche and you're sitting there and all of a sudden your name's called. Boy, your eyes get big and you hear what's being said. Well, Paul says, I want you to be of the same mind. I want you to be able to get along. And then he implores the church, you help them get along. Well, why is that so important? Well, Paul says, let your moderation, let your gentleness be known. Your folks that get along. Your folks that look for the good of the group and not the good necessarily in a selfish manner. The servant of the Lord, thus, Paul would write to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24, servant of the Lord must not strive or must not argue, must not be quarrelsome, depending upon what translation, once again, you use. All of those are correct with regards to the word. It's the idea of don't be argumentative. Don't go looking for fights. Don't go looking for trouble. Be an individual that lives at peace with all men, Romans chapter 12, verse 17. And so God says, here's your formula. Here's your formula for happiness. Learn to be gentle. And so, if you're there in Philippians, if you look in chapter 2, he says, let nothing be done through selfishness or vain conceit, lowliness of mind. Let each esteem others better than themselves, looking not upon his own things, but also on the things of others, right? Isn't that what he said in verses 3 and 4 of Philippians 2? He says, do what? He says, think about other folks. Be concerned about them. Be gentle. And so happiness, first of all, starts in how we relate to others. That we're gentle with folks. Like so, once again, may not always see eye to eye, may not always agree. Last week we talked about Paul and Barnabas. Remember, they were together, but then they split. And they came back together, thankfully. But it's an idea that learn to be that type of person. And when you do, guess what? Happiness follows. You know why? You're not fussing and fighting all the time. You learn to love and lean upon individuals. And so Paul says, happiness, first of all, starts with relating to others, but then he says it's also with regards to the Lord's abiding presence. There's the second part of our formula. There's the second element we're going to add to our formula. Verse 5, once again, let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Now, when we think about that, we think about the Lord being at hand, we have to ask ourselves exactly what he means. Because there are two possibilities. Does he mean that he is at hand with regards to time and space? In other words, as the psalmist said, and it's interesting, once again, get your concordance down sometime this week and look at how many times the psalmist talks about the Lord is at hand. And it's several. The Lord is near. The Lord is close. And so we ask ourselves, we look at the verse and say, okay, part of my formula for happiness that God's giving me is the fact that the Lord is at hand. Does it mean time and space, that he's present, that he's close by? Or does it mean, as some have suggested, that he's talking about he's coming soon? He's coming back. And so the question then revolves around one of those two answers, time and space or second coming. I lean towards the idea of time and space. You know, the scriptures tell us again and again, God is at hand. God is at hand. God is at hand. He's not forsaken us. He's not left us. He's there. And so as we're reminded of those things, I think that's what he's talking about. You might say, well, I think he's talking about second coming. It's kind of interesting because as I was studying this week and studying this idea in this verse, I forgot now who said it, but I know it was in Wayne Jackson's little class commentary on Philippians, but he quoted it from somebody. He said, maybe it's both. Well, you know, that might be the chicken way out of answering it, but at the same time, too, it might be the correct answer. God is at hand. What a great promise to think about. You see, we often wonder where we can find help. We often wonder how we're going to get through it. We often wonder who's going to carry me through this life. Who's going to give me the answers that I need? Who's going to help me? And of course, we should rely upon men as well. After all, what did he say in the very first part of this verse? Let your gentleness be known to all men. But at the same time, too, we need God. We got to have God. In Psalm chapter 3, or the third Psalm, maybe we should say, in the third Psalm, the psalmist talks about one of the reasons, or many reasons, he gives about 4 or 5 reasons why we really need God in our life. And I think verse 8 is the summation of everything and really the reason why we need God. You know what he says? Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, within that greater context, and many folks believe that Psalm 3, David wrote it, and that David wrote it at a time in which he was being pursued by an enemy, and he was simply saying that the deliverance that God was going to give him from an individual was from God. Very true. But at the same time, too, that phraseology is used several times by David, and it refers to salvation as we would think of being delivered. But that's what salvation is, isn't it? It's delivered from sin, delivered from, if you will, Satan's clasp, being delivered from the pits of hell, being moved into the salvation of his dear Son. But happiness comes because we know that God is near. We know that God has not forsaken us. We know that God is our help. He's our salvation. He's our deliverer. We know that God is with us. And so happiness comes because why? Because God's not far off. Isn't that what Paul would tell the Athenians on Mars Hill? When he's telling them about God, and he tells them about God and explains to them that unknown God that they had. God is a God at hand and not a far off. The answer is yes. Paul was reminding them of this. And so in reminding them of this, he's simply saying you need to know. And you need to remember the promise of God. That I'll never leave you nor forsake you. I got to thinking about that phrase this week, and that's an interesting thought, to say the least. When I got to really getting down on studying on that, I noticed something. You go back to the old law, the Old Testament, and one of the things you find out is that God tells Moses, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Then God tells Moses to tell the children of Israel, and as Moses is bidding the children of Israel adieu, if you will, in his farewell speech, right at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 31, guess what? Moses he tells them of the words of God. What was the promise that God said? I'll never leave you nor forsake you. The same thing, guess what? Moses told Joshua. And guess what? In Joshua 1, you find it again, where Joshua is reminded, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. What did they find? They found a comfort. They found an assurance. They found a hope in the promise of God. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. We too can as well. We find an easiness to know that this world seemingly shuts us out and shuts us down. When this world turns against us, God doesn't. God's present. And so, part of our formula that God gives us, an element, if you will, that we're going to put in for our happiness, is not just the gentleness that we need with regards to people, but the presence of God in our lives. Then thirdly, verse 6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Guess what he says? He says, you want to be happy? Don't worry. Don't worry. Yeah, sure. That's easier said than done, isn't it? Because ultimately, then, here's what a lot of Christians do. You know, I wasn't worried to the preacher. You preached about worry. Then all of a sudden, I realized maybe I worried. When I first started preaching one Sunday, I decided to worry. It was one of the first sermons that I delivered. My sweet wife said, you worried more about that sermon about worry than you did any other sermon. Yet the Bible tells us, don't worry. Be anxious in nothing. There are certain things in your life that you can't control, and there are certain things in your life that you cannot control. We recently talked about some things on Sunday morning sermon. We talked about some things that you can control. You can control your attitude. You can control the way you treat people. In many ways, you control your salvation because God has offered it and said, here it is, and all you have to do is answer the call. There are certain things you cannot control. You cannot control your lifespan. You might say, well, I can take medicine and live a little longer, or I can take my life, and there's truth to that. But remember, the psalmist said in Psalm 90 and verse 10, he says that the days of our years are 70 years, and by reason of strength, 80 years, and then we are soon cut off. We fly away. You can't control the past. It's already over. It's already finished. It's already done. There's nothing that you can do. There's nothing that you can say that will change the past. It's already taken place. And yet, 40% of the things that we worry about are the things that have already happened that you and I cannot change. You can't change what other people say about you. You may like to. You may want to, and you may wish that they had said different things about you than what they said, and you might correct what they said, but you still can't change what they say about you. And they may tell the truth, they may tell how wonderful you are, or they may make up something and tell that you're a dog. They may do that. But at the same time, too, you can't change those things. Now, here's my question. There are things that you can change. And so if they need to be changed, guess what? You change them. But there are certain things you have no control over. And so both of those two areas are the things that we worry about most. We worry about either one. If we can, we need to change it. And things we can't control, you can't do anything about it. And yet we worry. But what else do we worry about? Well, we worry about life. We worry about clothing. We worry about food. And yet Jesus said that there's more to life than that. And he goes on to say, as he's talking there in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 25, he talks about is not life more than food and raiment. And he goes on, he says what? He tells us, he says, behold the grass of the field, which today is, tomorrow's cut down. Well, what is it used for? Well, it's used for, as we studied here on Wednesday night not long ago, it's used for the fire to cook food. And then he talks about the birds of the air. As he's talking about our clothing, he talks about Solomon. Solomon was not arrayed like one of these. He talks about how the birds of the air, they neither sow nor reap nor gather in the barns. Yeah, he says you're more valuable than those. But he also asks a question. He says, which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit, 18 inches, to your stature? Nobody. And so he concludes then in verse 33 by simply saying, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Now, when you begin to study the idea of the kingdom there, you have to understand the word kingdom. We've always said, well, it's the church. And we've almost relegated the word kingdom to the idea of the organization of the church. But go back and study the word kingdom. And as you study the word kingdom in scriptures, one of the things you find out is, yes, it refers to the church, but not just the organization of the church, but to individuals. And thus, we as the kingdom live the kingdom life. You might say, I don't get that. Well, when Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, he says, seek the Lord first. Above all things. Above all the food and the raiment, above all the worries of life, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Seek the Lord, seek his church, seek his people. And he says, God will add all these things to you. And then he tells us in verse 34 basically this, only be concerned about today. Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof. Take no thought for tomorrow. And yet in many ways you could say, not only don't take any thought of tomorrow, but don't take thought of yesterday. It's over, it's done. Don't worry. Well, it's not that old really, but the song that came out that was popular back a few years ago, Don't Worry, Be Happy, is a good song from that standpoint, that philosophy. Don't worry, be happy. Now, let us understand that forethought and worry are two different things. We may think in advance. We may think of, okay, I need to save up, and how am I going to save up money for a rainy day, for when the car goes out, or for when the heat goes out, or when the roof plays out, or when the rent's coming, or the house payment's coming, or the insurance payment's coming, or there's going to be a day in which you're going to need a little extra money because the doctor's going to come around, or the medicine's going to come around, or whatever it may be. And so we give it some forethought. That's not what worry is. Worry is consumed with the idea so much so that it's all that you think about. When you wake up, all day long, and when you're going to bed, it's the only thing you're thinking about. It so consumes your mind about how are things going to work out? How are things going to be? Someone has said that when we pray, and notice that that's the very next thought, but by everything by prayer. You see, when we pray, that helps us with our concerns. Because we can pray, number one, for the past, that what? We're forgiven of anything in the past. We can pray for the present, because in praying for the present, what are we doing? We're asking for the needs that meet this point in time in our life. And then we can pray for the future, that God will give us the guidance that we need to get through the life that we live at that point in time. And so then the ultimate question comes back, if that be true, and yes, I believe that it is, then Paul has hit the nail on the head. You want to be happy? He says, don't worry, pray. Turn it over to God. Let God handle it. Praying always with all prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Paul would write with regards to, and right at that point, and where he's been talking about the Christian armor in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18. Praying always. You see, prayer then is accompanied, notice what Paul says in this verse, with thanksgiving. When you start to be thankful for stuff, and you start to count your blessings, and you start to remember what God has given to you and where it has come from, guess what? It's going to lead to happiness. Because you quit looking at what you don't have and you start looking at what you do have. You quit looking at what everybody else has got and you say, well, I've got this, and I've got that, and I've got the other, and it's getting me through. And so Paul says, you want to be happy? He says, don't worry, pray, and pray with thanksgiving. God will take care of you. And so happiness comes with being individuals that don't worry, but pray. But then Paul says, you need to think properly. You might say, well, how does thinking properly work with happiness? Well, let's think about it a couple of minutes here. In Proverbs 23, verse 7, as a man thinks in his heart what he, so is he. And so he says a little earlier in Proverbs chapter 4, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it come the issues of life. In other words, be careful what you think, because what you think is what you become. What you think is what you are. Now, doesn't it make sense then that when the Bible talks about it, and it talks a little bit more about it than we realize, about the idea of meditation. Now, meditation is not sitting cross-legged on the floor with your fingers in a circle going home. That's not meditation that God's talking about. Now, that's meditation, but that's not the meditation that God's talking about. God's talking about focus all your energy on thoughts. Well, there are many verses, but probably the two that we're most familiar with, Psalms chapter 1, or first Psalm 1, beginning in verse 1. Remember where he reminds us to spend time thinking. He says, as he talks about the man of God, his delight is in the law, remember? And in the law does he meditate, think, ponder, sit, consume with. Does he meditate day and night? And so thinking is important. It's because that's what we become, that's what we are, that's the direction that we live, and that's what then influences our attitudes and our way of life. And so, look at our text. Look what he says. He says, brethren, you really want something to think about? I shared with a few today. We were with, Suzanne and I, we were with what would amount to both of our nieces, our great niece, our great two of our great nephews, my sister and brother-in-law, yesterday. And our great niece turned 4 tomorrow, actually, but we were celebrated Saturday. Cute as a bug on a rug. But the little boy, our great nephew, will be 7 sometime soon. And he's already told his mama, or he's told his daddy, I'm bored. He hadn't been out of school but 2-3 days. I'm bored. My brother-in-law pulled him off to the side and he said, come here, Levi. But he did it where we could all hear. He said, you see that there? And the little girl, for her birthday, she had gotten some little garden tools to help with her dad and her pop in the garden. She got a little hoe, she got a little rake, a little shovel, all cute, usable. My brother-in-law said, Levi said, look over there. He said, you see what that is? He said, yeah. And he said, when I was a little boy, he said, now how old are you? He knew, but he said, how old are you? He said, well, I'm 6. I'll be 7. He said, that's right. He said, that was the very age. He said, I found it the other day in all of my stuff that I got from my daddy. He said, there was a hoe that had an adult size handle in it that my daddy, or my mother rather, my mother and I every Monday morning during the summer got up. And he said, just at your age, and we went out every Monday and hoed the garden. Now, your mom and daddy's got a big garden, don't they? Yeah. He said, I'll bring you that hoe. Little boy said, I'm not bored. You see, it's important. It's important. Okay. Well, what do we think about? We think about, first of all, things that are true. Things that are factual. Factual. Then he says, whatsoever things are noble. The word noble means reverent. Whatsoever things are just. The word just is interesting. It has the idea of thinking on things that are of an acceptable standard according to God's standard. Whatsoever things are pure, holy. Holy is the idea. Agios, holy. Whatsoever things are lovely. Those are the things that come up with the, I guess the best way of saying, with the explanation of being love, lovely. Those things that this is lovely. Oh, this is wonderful. Good report. Lovely. Good report then is just that, the idea of well thought, good report, good end. If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, if there's anything good about this, anything worthwhile, anything noticeable, it's just think of these things. These are the things you think. You don't want to be bored in life. So what do? Paul says, think on these things. Think on the things that are think on the things that are of God's standards. Think on the things that are lovely. Think on the things that bring about good. Think about the things that are true, that are factual. Don't think about the gossip. Don't think about the dirt. Don't think about the ugly things. Turn off a lot of this TV that is just literally garbage. And think about the good things of life. Spend time with the good things of life. You want happiness? Don't be dragged into the mud. Rise above it. And then it's interesting. There are other things that he talks about. He goes on down and he talks about that he had learned in whatsoever state he was to be content. He'd learned to be happy. He'd learned contentment. He'd learned to be happy. The word learned there is interesting because it has the idea of learning through experience. You can learn through books, but you can also learn through experience. And that word there that's used, manthano, is the idea of I learned through experience. Do what? Ought to be happy. Well, it's kind of interesting. Go back to the first chapter and the third chapter, really, and he'll talk about how that their contribution from the church of Philippi had a little problems. And yet Paul said, I've had a lot and I've had a little, but I've learned whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Learn to be happy. Rejoice in the Lord. Happiness comes by what? Relationship with people, relationship with God, relationship with life, learning to be happy, learning to be thankful. Finally, a relationship with what we think. Happiness. God's formula for happiness. Yeah. Not every day's sunshine. Not every day's great. Not every day is full of rainbows and white fluffy clouds. There's days of gray and days that are dark. There are days that are hurtful and days that really bring us down because of the things in our life. And that's fine. Understand what they are and where they are. Get the help that you need. But understand, here are some things that Paul says will help you through life as you travel, especially on those dark and dreary days. This evening, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you need to rededicate your life, our prayer is that you'll come while together we stand and sing.